Rajamohan, and dear participants, very good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the NICE ISS Joint Seminar on New World Order post COVID-19. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Professor Rajamohan will be introducing ISS before the presentation. At the time when there is lots of discussion and debates that the COVID-19 pandemic will shift the world order, we are doing a series of talk on how it is really going to impact on the existing world order. There are speculations that China might take a lead, while many believe that it is too early to come to that conclusion. Some claim that the world is moving towards multipolar world. There are a number of other speculations. To discuss on this issue, we have the director of ISS, Professor Rajamohan. I'd like to welcome Professor Rajamohan and thank him for his valuable time. Professor Rajamohan needs no introduction, but to follow the tradition, let me formally introduce you. Professor C Raja Mohan is Director, Institute of South Asian Studies. Earlier, he was Professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Professor Rajamohan has been associated with a number of think tanks in New Delhi, including the Institute of Defense Study Analyses, the Center for Policy Research, and Observer Research Foundation. He was also the founding director of Carnegie India. He was the Henry Alfred Kissinger Chair in International Affairs at the United States Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. He served as India's National Security Advisor at India's National Security Advisory Board. He's one of the India's leading commentator on India's foreign policy. He's also on the editorial board of a number of Indian and international journals on world affairs. Professor Rajamohan has a master's degree in nuclear physics and a PhD in international relations. Among his recent books are Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere and Influence. We'd like to request our participants to drop questions in the chat box or in the comments below the Facebook Live. Professor Rajamohan, the floor is yours. You have around 25 to 30 minutes.
Thank you. Many thanks, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for inviting me. Really delighted to be with all of you this Sunday morning in Nepal and India. I want to begin by congratulating Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for developing NICE into such a dynamic platform in a very, very short period. So let me wish you all success with this platform and to all your colleagues who are working at NIICE. Let me say a few words at the outset on my own place of work, the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Of course, National University of Singapore is more than 100 years old. The South Asian Studies Institute was set up about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And I think the focus of our work is largely on studying contemporary South Asia, assessing various developments in the region, especially economics and trade. Then we look at international relations and security, and then the political developments within South Asia. We also look at some of the diaspora-related issues, how the subcontinent's diaspora is doing internationally. So that's broadly the area of work. Those of you who are interested in what we do, we put everything out on the website. It is isas.nus.edu.sg. So do visit and see what we do. There should be a lot of stuff there of interest to anybody who is from South Asia or interested in South Asia. What I thought I'll do in the next a few minutes is really to identify 5 broad themes of change that seem to be unfolding in the post-COVID world. Many of these themes, as you'll notice, had actually begun before we were affected by the COVID-19 crisis. But after the pandemic has hit the world, these tendencies have acquired much greater speed and a lot sharper edge, and the policy issues that they pose to the rest of the world have also become far more urgent and immediate. So within that, what the 5 themes I want to explore are, one is the renewed, the return of the great power rivalry after the end of the Cold War. That seems to be a major trend that is going to be with us. Second is the growing doubts about economic globalization that has so dominated our lives for the last at least 3.5 decades. Then there is the question of technological transformation, especially in the digital domain, how it might affect the world in the days ahead. And the 4th theme I want to touch on is the multilateral institutions, how the international system and its various institutions are under stress amidst the COVID crisis and renewed Sino-American rivalry. And lastly, I just want to touch briefly on the challenges that the COVID crisis compels us to look at of the relationship between man and nature, particularly the animal world. In fact, the transition of this virus from through mediated by the animal world to humanity. And this problem, by all indications, is not just going to go away. So let me start by looking at the great power rivalry as one of the dominant themes. Now, when the Cold War ended in 89-90, the Berlin Wall fell in Europe and the Soviet Union collapsed. It was widely assumed that, look, the world was in a unipolar moment, that the US, the unprecedented weight of the US in the international system, its economic and military power, and its international influence marked the emergence of a unipolar world. But the unipolar world ended up rather a brief exception rather than a permanent feature. In fact, within a decade, that is by the early 2000s, we saw the first signs of stress emerging in the unipolar world, and other great powers beginning to look for ways in which they could give themselves a little more room for action. By the end of the first decade of the 2000s or the 21st century, we saw the greater affirmation of Russia, the reaffirmation of Russia, the dramatic rise of China and its impact on the international system. And we also saw the growing differences within the Western world, that is between US and Europe, on a range of issues. If you recall, not all European powers supported American intervention in Iraq, and the problems of how to deal with the New World Order were beginning to emerge even within the Western world, and we saw all those differences emerge. But what's happened in the last few years is, of course, the central theme is the question of the US-China rivalry, the dramatic transformation of China in the last 4 decades after it started reform, and its emergence as the world's second largest economy, and its ability to, I think most people would agree that in the next few years, it will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. But of course, there'll be significant gaps in the per capita incomes of the Americans and the Russians. But the rise of China and the tensions that have begun to brew between them were already there before the COVID crisis. But after the COVID crisis, they've acquired a much greater intensity. The trade disputes, for example, they had already begun under Trump, but now the conflict and tension has become much larger on the trade-related issues. It's also beginning to envelop new areas like 5G and other technological areas where the US and China are at loggerheads. And a whole range of issues and institutions are today under stress across the world. And within them, of course, one of the central question is, how does China relate to the US alliances in Asia? Historically, after the end of the Second World War, US had a large number of alliances, but the rise of China is beginning to probe the sustainability of those alliances. We've seen the US-Philippines alliance, or the US-South Korea alliance, actually tested by the emergence of China. So the future of the US alliances in Asia under stress as China rises. And then more broadly, that for 70 years, the US dominated Asia, and East Asia in particular. Can that be sustained if China seeks and pushes for a more dominant role in Asia? I think where I live in Singapore, that is, and much of East Asia, the principal question is what happens to the regional institutions and the international system as China rises and reshapes its Asian periphery, expands its influence into Eurasia, and attempts to construct a new international system. So I think that is now unquestionably the biggest issue, and I think a lot of other issues will get subsumed underneath it. So as this tension mounts, I think there will be compulsions on most countries to adapt to this. Just as we dealt with the US-Russia Cold War immediately after the Second World War, that if this is the dominant theme, everyone has to find a way of dealing with this situation. And unlike the US-Soviet Cold War, many countries could opt out in Asia in the name of non-alignment. But in this case, China is a neighbor, and I think the stress is going to be a lot more stronger for all the countries living in Asia, especially those in China's neighborhood. I wouldn't want to go into who is winning this emerging Cold War between US and China, but I think, as Dr. Jaiswal said, look, it is something, that's the story of the next few decades, and there's no point trying to judge who is going to be the winner. It's more, I think, valuable for us to see the structure, what it means for the rest of the world. But are there any constraints in an uninhibited, relentless Cold War between these two powers? I think there is some internal volatility. Certainly, it is all visible in the United States. United States is deeply polarized. So therefore, whether the policies that Mr. Trump has adopted, will they be sustained under a potential Biden administration, or will there be significant changes? That remains to be seen. We know less about the internal volatility in China, but as this tension mounts between the two powers, it won't be surprising that produces multiple arguments within China on how to deal with the United States. But I won't be surprised if those arguments are already there. So therefore, I think it's good for all of us who live in China's neighborhood to take this, to look at this rivalry and to look at the domestic developments in both the countries with some care and objectivity, rather than jumping to conclusions and making judgments about which is this horse race and who is going to win this horse race. So that's my first set of issues I wanted to highlight. The second, I think, subject is of equal consequence for all of us, certainly in South Asia and the rest of the world, developing world in particular. It is the prospect of moving from globalization to deglobalization, if you will. At least for South Asia, I mean, starting from the late 80s, early 90s, that there was a new economic model, and that many of the models that we had adopted in the name of socialism in one country, state-led development, all that cracked up as a new consensus in favor of economic globalization emerged. From the US, it is called the Washington Consensus. But China was very much part of that Washington Consensus. In fact, the Washington Consensus was about drawing China into the global economy, and China became part of the WTO in the 1990s, and that late 1990s, and that set the stage for an expansive engagement between the two that transformed the world. So now, while the central features of this globalization war, really, if you want to use just one phrase, it is open borders. That borders must be open for movement of capital and the movement of labor, that these should be able to move freely as the world seeks a more efficient way of organizing global production and distribution. So while in the past, though capitalism existed long before this development, that capitalism seemed to have been nationally organized, and that there would have to be some understandings negotiated between different powers. But this idea that you can develop a single set of rules for all the countries where free movement of capital, labor, and other things could take place, that was the assumption under which the Washington Consensus operated. And it looked like it was working for everyone. In fact, it seemed to India. China, of course, went to globalization from the late 70s. India joined in the 90s. And most other countries adopted it, Asian countries in between, and most of South Asia by the 90s was trying that. But I think this idea that globalization will work for everyone was the mantra a few years ago. But that mantra has come under stress in the last few years, and that mantra is going to come even under greater stress in the post-COVID world. The interesting thing about the contestation of the virtues of globalization did not come from the developing world. In fact, much of the developing world said we like globalization, it is benefiting us, whatever the arguments we had otherwise. So therefore, it was generally assumed Asia was now, including China, were all in favor of globalization. But the resistance to globalization has come from Trump in the US, who's mobilized the American working class, if you will, that was seen as losing from unfettered globalization. That is the large constituency that Trump mobilized in the 2016 elections. And if anyone of you had a chance to see his rally a few hours ago in Tulsa, would notice he's cycling up the same themes, that the American jobs were shipped to China, China has exploited the United States, open borders, and that the US cannot have a world in which others take advantage of it. Whether he will sell this a second time to the American public, we don't know. But I think this argument that globalization has not worked for everyone, and certainly not worked for important constituencies in the United States and the developed world, is now a reality. But I think the COVID crisis has actually sharpened some of those issues. For example, the question of do we organize our economies on the basis of efficiency, or do we organize it on the basis of self-reliance, or these days Prime Minister Modi is talking about Atmanirbharta, but I think what the COVID crisis showed was, if China was producing 90% of the world's drugs and most of the intermediaries, can you rely on one country to be able to deal with a crisis of the kind that suddenly hit the world? So I think many countries today are recognizing that, look, efficiency might be good for capitalists, but for a nation, for a society, for emergencies, resilience is as important as efficiency. That is, you can say, look, we'll produce it in the cheapest place. China was the best place to produce. Therefore, efficiency demanded all production can be concentrated within China. But China is run by a state, and the question whether you can trust China to be a custodian of the global pharmacy, that questions have arisen, and now many countries are saying resilience is as important. Shortening supply chains is as important as having efficiency. So therefore, what we saw happen in the last 3 decades of production could be shipped out largely to China and to a few other places like Mexico, a little bit to Southeast Asia. That has raised questions whether globalization is the best form of social organization. Because for many in the US are arguing, if you're in Ohio, a large community, your factory in your community has moved out from Ohio to somewhere in China because that was more efficient economically. That was the argument on which we saw a lot of production move to the developing world. But people are asking the question, is a society merely an efficient economic unit? Or is it a society? Is it a community? That is, do we owe each other something when we live in a community? But if I'm running a factory in Birganj, tomorrow I'll just take it off and say, look, I go to Maldives or somewhere else and say, look, that's a more efficient thing to do. Or do we say, no, you can't take out factories out of places? There are people, there are human beings, there are working people and communities built around these large factories. So I think that question is the central one that is underlying. Can you really take everything out on instantaneous decision because that is better for the capital? And therefore, the question of communities and the tension between maintaining social communities versus maintaining economic efficiency, that has become a huge issue in the COVID crisis and beyond. That brings me to the third set of issues, which are really about the impact of technology on the world. And starting from 2000, I mean, you could see the internet came around the mid-90s in a popular form, and the sense that the new digital technologies were going to liberate human beings from the control of the state, that borders do not matter, that I could sit in a small town or a village in my home state of Andhra and then engage with somebody in the United States, in Australia, in Russia, in China. The idea that we are free agents and the technology was going to liberate us from the dominance of states, old forms of oppression. And that was a dominant kind of utopian vision that we had in the late 90s as the digital world enveloped the world. But what we're now discovering, actually, that was a myth. And that today, the way the digital technologies have been deployed by governments, especially after the COVID crisis, has seen actually strengthening the state vis-a-vis this idea of a borderless world. One of the first things countries did during the COVID crisis was shut down borders, shut down flights. And more interestingly, we also saw the state actually using the new technologies of digital technologies for monitoring, for surveillance, that what was the technology that was supposed to liberate us. This argument is particularly been raised in relation to China. How China used big data, artificial intelligence, to track the movement of those who are spreading the virus, those who are affected by this virus, and using this data and surveillance to control the crisis. You could say, look, the idea that even before the COVID, the idea of a surveillance state that was like in China, which was maintaining social credit scores, knowing everything that you've done. If you've done one traffic violation, maybe you'll be let off 3 times, your social credit score would go. So the human beings were going to be subjected to this enormous monitoring and control through the new technologies of big data, artificial intelligence, and internet. So that seemed to be a new reaffirmation of the dangers of authoritarianism that seemed to come out of China. But people also pointed to the emergence of surveillance capitalism as opposed to surveillance state. What the Chinese state does, today Google, Apple, Amazon collect a whole lot of information, and whether they're monetizing it for the individual purposes or the collective good are issues that are being debated. So therefore, both surveillance capital as well as surveillance state are today a reality. And we saw in the pandemic the marriage of state and digital technology to get a far more effective control over the virus. But of course, pandemic demands surveillance. I mean, that there's no escaping that you need to trace people who've been affected. You need to monitor them. Who did they come into contact? How did they spread the virus? So who do you give protection to? All these became central to the management of the virus in the modern age. And within that, the digital technologies were quite central. So therefore, there are good things about surveillance technology. You need some of it, but that those technologies can actually be used to control human lives long after the virus disappears from our lives. So therefore, this whole question of how much of surveillance, how do you protect individual rights, within that is going to be with us as an issue after the COVID crisis, irrespective of whether capitalist society, free societies, everywhere, the question of data collection, who owns it, who controls it, and under what conditions will they deploy it are going to be issues. Another thing that has come after the COVID crisis is really all of us. I mean, like my work has increased thanks to Zoom. I do more webinars now. I don't get to office because I'm not supposed to go to office. So I'm talking to you on a Sunday morning using Zoom, which normally I wouldn't have done. But the fact that today a lot of us are working from home, using the new technologies, and that fact that we can connect. I mean, Dr. Jaiswal sitting in Kathmandu and I can connect like this, and we can bring a set of people across continents together is fantastic. But what does that mean for longer term? That what happens to the big office buildings that the world has built in downtown places? So all these areas, I think, are going to be that the question of whether the nature of the work itself is going to change, whether the nature of downtown offices, people, everyone going into the office and doing it. So some people think the office, which was invented at the beginning by the East India Company to keep track of what was happening, probably has come to the end of its life. But that might be an extreme prediction. But what we are going to get is, I think, a combination of using home-based work as one part of life that might supplement the offices of the past. So these are some of the areas where technology is going to affect the way the post-COVID life is going to evolve. Two other issues I wanted to touch, and then we can close and open for discussions. One is the international system as opposed to great powers. How are the international institutions working? We've seen this whole argument on the WHO, whether the WHO actually serve its designated role. Was it too much under the influence of the Chinese, or was it too much deferential to the Chinese concerns, and that it did not warn the rest of the world sufficiently in advance or convey to the rest of the world the severity of the crisis? I mean, that is the substance of the argument from the US, and many in the West believe that. And the majority of the developing countries too, like we saw in the World Health Assembly meeting, they want some inquiry, some understanding of how this has happened. What we're seeing then is how this plays out. Of course, we'll see. But the fact is, all major international institutions, whether it is the World Trading Organization or the World Health Organization, whether it is UN Security Council or G20, all these institutions are going to come under stress because of the US-China rivalry and some of the new issues that have emerged. That the conditions that produced the great power cooperation in the multilateral institutions in the 1990s no longer exist. That in the past, when everyone was getting along with the others, that the great powers were getting along with each other well, there was no tension in the multilateral institutions. But today, as great powers fight with each other, the stress on the international institutions is going to get a lot more severe and consequential in the days ahead. Meanwhile, we're also seeing the creation of new institutions, which are going to, some of them will survive, some of them will not. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the so-called Quad and Quad Plus. We have the BRICS. So these institutions, how many of them will survive? How many of them will get reinforced as the old institutions get under stress remains to be seen. And finally, I mean, the last point I wanted to touch was really the whole question of man and nature. In the last 20, 30 years, we've debated the question of climate change and whether it is in Kathmandu or Delhi, the air pollution. So the climate change, where in the 70s, many of us in the developing world used to reject it as not as our issue. It was an issue for the advanced countries, and that it is really trying to impose, conditions on our development. The fact, as you all saw, I mean, I saw these wonderful pictures of Kathmandu where you could see the whole Himal when the air pollution was removed, or in Delhi, where suddenly the air quality improved when the economies got locked down. That was a temporary relief, I presume. But the fact is, climate change is today a life and death issue, and I think the full impact of it is going to be felt. On top of it today, what the COVID world has done, post-COVID world, is our relationship to the other living beings not climate in abstract, because we're always worried about protecting the tiger and those kind of things, but the larger question is the expansion of human habitats. So what is it doing to the natural habitat, and the nature of the relationship between man, animal, and the virus, how that is going to develop in a world where the old buffer zones are disappearing. So I think that is a huge issue that we need to debate at this point of time. So I would say I would stop here and just conclude by saying that the challenges as we look ahead are really, one is the great power rivalry, that the US-China rivalry is quite central to what's going to happen in the world. The second, I think, on the globalization, it's an issue, live issue for all of us in the days ahead, how the globalization and its institutions are going to adapt, and how we're going to adapt to potential changes of rules to trade, investment, and a whole lot of things that are going to happen. On technology, I mean, all of us in every country, all of us are using apps to deal with the virus. And I think the kind of issues it raises to social organization are huge, and we need to deal with them. And finally, multilateral institutions, as I just said, are going to be redesigned in one form or the other, and the struggle to redefine those is going to do a lot of damage to the current system. And finally, on the question of man and nature. So these are 5 broad themes. We could discuss this in whatever form in the next half an hour, 40 minutes. It's up to Dr. Jaiswal to take it forward. Thank you, Pramod, and thank you all for listening.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We have got lots of questions, so I'll directly move to the question. Let me start with the first question on Cold War, as you have also touched upon it. We asked a similar question to Noam Chomsky yesterday, like, is there the possibility of second Cold War between China and the United States? What is the likelihood of such confrontation escalating into a hot war?
Want to give me 2, 3 more together, or?
Yeah, maybe I'll take 3 in a group. Second is, why has China refuted to sort out the border issue with India? What is the reason behind the tension between India and China? Does China want to warn India not to approach the United States? The third question is, there are debates in India regarding the need of rethink on one China policy. What strategies should India make about Tibet in context of
Yeah, so there are 3 questions. I mean, to sum up, I mean, I think one was on the US-China Cold War. The second was on the India-China conflict, right? I mean, that's what.
Yes.
Yeah, and the third was on the one China policy.
One China policy, yes.
So on the US-China Cold War, I think we're really at the beginning of a phase, whether there is actually Cold War. I mean, how you describe it as a Cold War, that too is that there are issues, and those of you who do IR would know there are serious problems with that as well. So I would say that the difference, so it's good to think of the difference between the old Cold War and this one. In the Cold War between Russia and America, the Russians opted out of the global system. The Russians said, the Soviet Union said, we are building an alternative system. You are capitalist, we are socialist. You have NATO, we have Warsaw Pact. While they sat together in the UN, there was very little systematic cooperation between the two sides. But China is not today outside the system. China is inside the system. China is part of the capitalist system. China is today the second largest capitalist economy, and that China is integrated into the global capitalist system. So therefore, the idea that you can simply defeat it. So that model of the 20th century, second half of 20th century model might not necessarily apply. But I think we might have to look at the 19th century, where the capitalist states fought with each other. That led to the 2 great wars, First World War and the Second World War. So I think we'll have to adapt to our mental frames. But the important thing is we are at the beginning of a crisis. We will see which direction this will go and what is the best way of describing it. But the imperatives of conflict are growing. And even if Trump is defeated in the election, we see that President Biden, he said, look, on trade issues, he's going to take a harder line. On security issues too, there is a whole new approach that might emerge even if Biden comes out. So I think it's not a settled question. But what we do know at this point is the tensions between the two are deepening and are likely to continue. Second, I think on the India-China conflict, look, I think India and China have dealt with these issues bilaterally, and whether it is sort of this idea that somehow we just make one phone call to Washington and the Americans will jump in. I mean, that said, that's not the way the world works. And one of the arguments in the US itself is the US itself is debating, look, should they get into all the other conflicts? India is not a treaty-based ally of the United States, or that the US is obliged to come and defend us. And in any case, the Indians have made it very clear this is something they want to deal with it on a bilateral basis rather than involve other parties. But if the conflict expands, something else develops, we'll see. But at this point, India hopes to manage this on the basis of its own steam and not get other powers involved in the conflict. Third, I think this one China policy, look, I think, as you know, in South Asia, we talk all the time. There's no, like this seminar, there's no shortage of discussions. So I think you shouldn't take everything that happens in Delhi think tanks too seriously as some kind of policy decision. So nobody in the government has ever said that. And my sense is the governments are quite, committed to one China policy at this point. But this is something I don't see that changing in any fundamental manner in the near future.
Let me move to the next set of questions. The first is, in your book, Power Realignment in Asia, you said that China's rise affects not only the security and economies of India and the United States, but also the new Indo-US strategic partnership. Do you mean it is necessary to contain China by any means? Second, you mentioned about multilateral institutes. I have read your article on Commonwealth of Nations. How can the Commonwealth remain relevant in the post-COVID-19 world? What role can India play in the post-COVID Commonwealth? Third question is future of new Asian century a shattered dream? In concert of democracy, an unsustainable option to balance China? How can India and China reach a new modus vivendi?
Look, what was the first question you said? Sorry, I was right.
Your book talks about China's rise has affect not only the security.
Got it. Yeah, see, look, I don't think anybody in the world is saying containment is an option. That China is too big. I mean, China is so strong that the idea of containing China is no one takes it seriously. What people are talking about is balancing of limiting some of China's unilateral policies. No one is saying to contain, because as I said, China is not Russia. China is not Soviet Union. China is deeply interconnected to the US economy. And I think that's what makes it very, very different. Apple produces iPhones mostly in China. Google, Amazon, for every American company, China is the biggest market. So this is a very different relationship. And this is not about, that's why I think we must stop being obsessed with the concepts from the second half of the 20th century. I think we need to step back into the history of IR in a longer term. And there was a period when there were no socialist powers. There was a period when all powers were capitalist and there were fights among them. And I think that might offer us some interesting insights, but I think it's a fundamentally different situation than what we had before. Commonwealth, I think one of the reasons why Britain exited European Union was the idea that it can rediscover its links to the Commonwealth world. But it's not easy reviving this organization. There are 50 odd members. Some countries are interested. There are a lot of small countries. I think some effort will be made, but I think with 50 odd countries, there is a lot of synergy in terms of English language, in terms of English traditions of law, of property rights. So I think it gives a reasonable basis, but I think there'll be a lot of work involved in rebuilding Commonwealth to make it an effective organization. Look, I think the Asian century idea is an old one. I think it goes back to the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when idea of Asia came up. And we defined Asia in opposition to the West and the colonial powers and the imperial powers. But today, I think it is no longer a mere conflict between West and Asia, or it is Asia and West represented the two extremes of the world. Asia is far more interconnected to the West. As I mentioned, China's own case. And the fault lines within Asia are sharpening. I mean, that India-China conflict is one example. The China-Japan conflict is another example. China's territorial claims in South China Sea is another example. So this is no longer about Asia versus the West or Asia versus America. This really, that there are multiple fault lines within Asia, and they will in turn intersect with the larger dynamic that is taking place in the world. So it is a different world. Here again, I think we need new parameters to understand it.
Let me come with, yes, the third set of questions. The first is, can India trust United States in course of the hostile situation with China? Because it has come to news that Trump has sought help from Xi Jinping for his re-election. There is a similar question looking at the unpredictability of President Trump. Can India rely on his assurance to back India in case of conflict with China? Second is, how can we envision the legitimacy and functioning of international organization in the face of changing world order post-COVID, as we saw the US stopped funding WHO? Third is, how do we speculate in regard to the potential trade opportunities that South Asian economies could harness in the post-COVID world order, which is yet to get unfolded?
Okay, you rely on Trump. I mean, look, Trump is a very unique kind of leader. There have a lot of issues with him for many countries. So, but Trump is only, how much we pay attention to Trump as an individual, but he's also representing larger interests in the United States, for example, on the question of globalization, on the question of trade. So Trump is not the only one talking about it. But we know that the political leaders are always looking to re-election. I don't know if you heard of any leader who is not looking to get re-elected. In the US, luckily, can only do it once. So I think that's part of the game, but that's not the main game. I mean, I think today in the US is so polarized, people are willing to put up arguments against each other, and that's fine. But I think the problem is, it is important, I think, to pay attention to the deep structural change that is unfolding in the US and its impact on the rest of the world. So it is not that India would just go into a war with China because Trump is nice to it or Trump and Xi Jinping are fighting. So I think the states calculate these things far more deeply, and you can't really, it's not about individuals, but about the larger interests of nations. How individual leaders transcend it, mediate it is a different story. International organizations, my sense is the pressure on them has been growing, and I'm a pessimist given the deepening bilateral conflict between US and China, that whether the old order can survive in the same form. For example, WTO, which is unlike WHO, is a far more central today to the world's trade, economic well-being. But that organization, which came up, is now being questioned in the US deeply. Many of its functions are being taken away or being squeezed. So therefore, I think we are at a critical juncture. I mean, but the fact is, those of you look back and say, look, after all, nothing survives in the world. Change is the natural. There's only one thing constant in the world, that is change is inevitable. We've seen the League of Nations collapse. We've seen the UN rise. Probably we are seeing the end of the kind of institutions that we built in the 20th century, both because the power distribution in the international system has changed. The new issues that have come up are testing, for example, on climate change. After you negotiate something, the Americans walk out. Or you negotiate something with the Iranians, the Americans walk out. So can you construct solutions that are beneficial to everyone is a big question. And equally important is the question, how do you distribute the costs? Okay, everyone says climate change is a problem. But when it comes to distributing those costs, how will those costs be distributed to the various participants? How do you distribute the costs between nations? And I think that's where Trump's problem with India and China is. Look, they claim to be developing countries, but they're not paying any support, and Americans have to do all the heavy lifting. So I think those arguments will continue, and I think we'll have to deal with that. And lastly, what was it on trade? Look, it's always a good thing that neighbors should trade with each other. But the thing is, if the global institutions are going to be under stress, if regional institutions then acquire a natural weight, and within that, countries which are next door to each other would certainly want to do more trade. But in South Asia, of course, there are a whole range of other issues which have been because of the various political conflicts that we've not made as much progress as the other regions. But I think it is still far more critical, I think, for our region to be able to do more on trade with each other within the region as the global institutions come under stress.
Let's come with the other set of questions. What strategies do you think Afghanistan, as a weak state, is using to deal with great power that is China? Is Afghanistan opting for balancing between the United States and China? Second, serious foreign policy news has been virtually erased from Indian news television in this globalized era. How do you see the impact of this erasing or shaping of public opinion in India? Third is, states seems to be consolidating more power through surveillance, for example, Arogya Setu app in India, and marginalizing the subalterns, marginalized workers even further. In this context, how does one look at ethical use of technology post-COVID world?
Look, I think Afghanistan is going through a crisis, and they're not trying to balance between US and China. I mean, they want the international system to support them against the Taliban. They want international support for rebuilding a country that has been torn by 4 decades of conflict. They want countries to bring in some pressure on Taliban for a reasonable accommodation. So I don't think they're in a position to dictate terms, or they're trying to balance with anyone. So I think for Afghanistan today, survival, Afghanistan state survival, sustaining the peace process, and winning the international support. I mean, I don't think they're saying only Americans should help us or Chinese should not help us. They want everybody's help to be able to rebuild their society. The second question was, look, Indian media, forget international news. The media itself is under threat today. You've been hearing news about jobs being lost. I think the whole revenue model of the press, Indian press printing, that is the printed one, has grown dramatically in the last 50 years, certainly after the 90s, because of the dramatic expansion of industrial activity, advertising revenue. But that media itself is under stress, first from the television that came in, now social media. So this idea that that they're no longer the vibrant financial model, that they don't have that model. Second, people have diverse ways of getting information. So though I've written for newspapers, the Hindu and the Express, for long years, but I'm not going to just rely on Indian newspapers to tell me what's happening in the world today. I think people have a lot more options. So I don't think you should judge, but the fact is, what matters is India, for all the other difficulties it has, 40% of its GDP is linked to the rest of the world. Now, India has never been in that situation. So similarly for China. So this is a dramatic change. Today, if the Wall Street catches cold, I mean, India will start sneezing. Or the metaphor is the other way around. If Wall Street sneezes, Bombay, Dalal Street will catch a cold. That if something happens in, China, India has to stop flights from China. If something happens in, Kashmir, somebody is going to issue advisory saying don't go there. So it's a far more connected world. And I think dealing with that is part of a reality. And I think all of us are trying to cope with it in different ways. So the surveillance thing is not about subalterns. I think the subalterns have access to technology today, which they did not. Everybody has a smartphone. It is how corporations and state are using it to extend their dominance. That is the question. So, and within this, there are multiple conflicts. There's state versus citizen conflict. The rights, privacy, individual rights in a democracy or otherwise, how you relate these rights. Then you have the contestation between state and capital. You might not hear that in China, but when US government goes to Apple and says, look, open this phone, this is the phone of a terrorist, Apple says, no, I mean, I got rules on security. I want to give absolute security to my customers, and I'm not going to be able to do this to you. Or when government of India tells Twitter to take it down, or Facebook, that post is terrorism, and take it down. So those rules are still being negotiated. So it is not that it is just, state and citizen. There's a set between state and capital, there is a problem. Or between capital and capital. Apple has said, look, Google is misusing your data. So it is not just, Apple says, look, my model is different. I got a platform, I give you security, I'm not taking your data to make money, while Google and Amazon are doing that. So there is a conflict between large companies, what model of technology they're using. And finally, there is also the contestation between state and state on 5G. US and China are arguing what is the best way to organize 5G. So the multiple levels of conflict, I think we should be aware of all of them. Thank you. Pramod, do you want any more questions?
The next three questions are, yes, we have two more sets, sir. What are the likely impact of deglobalization and weakening of global institutions of achieving sustainable development goals? Second is, what are the challenges brought by accelerating trade, supply chains, capital and technology flows? How and under what condition, according to you, will they impact the liberal international order and domestic politics at large post-COVID? Third is, with issues like Washington consensus not working out and the Beijing style consensus also in trouble, what should be the way to conceptually look at global development? What should be the philosophy and approach behind loaning, and can be done without harming the current global economic order?
Okay, this is a very, very vast set of issues. I just mentioned some of them, but I think it's difficult to go deep into any of these very, very good and important questions. But I think we are, as I said, I think what is important to remember is all these challenges are going to mount. I mean, if you're sitting in Nepal or for South Asia, when the challenges of any significant environmental change, what it's going to do to the Great Himalayas, the rivers that come out of it. So what we heard about it in abstract term today, they're far more pressing issues. So one way is saying that, look, stop development. Another way of saying it is, look, let's find new technologies to manage this. So some areas there's optimism. For example, solar power today is becoming cheaper than hydroelectric coal in many places. So you have, on the one hand, technological change is giving you new solutions, new ways of doing it. On the other hand, the old ways of doing things, how do you, if you say, look, okay, in the US today, I was hearing President Trump, okay, somebody says green path, no more petroleum. Now, Trump is telling the people in Oklahoma, which is a major oil producing state, look, those guys are going to take away the gas industry. So what are you guys going to do? So vote for me. I'll keep oil as an important part of the economy. So I think the problem of costs, that if the other forms of energy technology producers, how do you deal with the old order, and how do you manage the transition from a fossil fuel centered economy to a different economy? Who is going to pay the costs of the transition? How will those costs be distributed between nations or within nations? So I think that's where the biggest issue in the end is about money. How do we generate the resources to, meanwhile, we're getting closer and closer to the precipice. So, but this is going to be something a real challenge as we look ahead for all of us. Yeah. You want the last set of questions, and we can.
Yes, we have the last set of questions, and this is basically more to do with the region. How do you look at the current India-Nepal map row? How can Government of India and Government of Nepal resolve this issue without harming the cordial relations? Second is, has India lost South Asia to China? What is the reason behind it? And third, where do you see Singapore between the great power rivalry, how it has managed it?
Look, I think, Indians are accused of telling Nepal what to do, so I'm not going to Nepal has taken certain decisions. Now, those are facts. And I think we'll have to, both the countries will have to now, we're in a new situation Nepal has a new map. India doesn't like that map. There's a new issue that has come up, and we'll have to deal with it. Now, in India, China have lived with a boundary dispute for the last 70 years. Sometimes well, sometimes not so well. Hopefully, we don't get into a conflict over it, and that we need to, if we think the bilateral relationship is an important one, while there's a new issue that must be addressed, we must keep moving forward where there is positive possibilities for progress. So India and Pakistan have problems. But if you look at Southeast Asia, where I live, a lot of unresolved disputes exist within ASEAN. But that has not stopped them from working with each other, taking advantage of each other, of benefiting from cross-border engagement and cooperation. So is it every right of Nepal to raise new issues? And I think it has raised one. India has to deal with it in the days ahead. But I hope we are sensible on both sides, that there are other things as well. Meanwhile, the life, liberty and happiness of people in both sides who live in the two countries must also be addressed. So there is a problem. That problem does not mean we don't cooperate in other areas. So it becomes even more important that we expand the areas of cooperation between us. The second question was on, what was it on?
Has China lost, has India lost?
Yeah. Look, it's not India's to lose, right? I mean, so this idea somehow India ke jagir rahe, so India has given it up. Or look, the world there's no place you can say, look, this is mine. I mean, so I think this is, anybody says it, I don't think people say it in Delhi that somehow South Asia is India's and it's India's to lose. Look, China is a large economy. As I said, it's the second largest economy. So China's influence in South Asia was bound to grow. It had that influence even when China was weak economically. Today, as a strong China is going to be far more central to the region's evolution. If India itself has a huge trade with China, I'm not telling you should not trade with China. So I think China is part of all of our lives, and I think China is as the second largest economy. China is having influence in Latin America, in places as far from it physically. So where is the question of China not having influence in South Asia? So the question is what it does to the international relations between China and India, within South Asia. So we are in a new phase, and hopefully that India-China will find ways to resolve their differences. And the region actually, if you're cynical, you must actually, it gives more opportunities to play the balancing game. I'm sure some countries are already doing it. But there is also the danger that when you are playing too complicated balancing games, sometimes can backfire. I would say it's ideal for all the countries in the region, wanting to have good relationship and benefit from economic engagement with both the countries, while avoiding the problems, political problems that are on the other side. So Nepal has two neighbors. So I think it's logical that Nepal engages both India and China, benefits from two of the world's large economies, and prospers. So if I were Nepali, my focus would be how do I benefit from India and China? Not by saying is India against China or China against India, but I say, look, I need investment, technology, assistance, whatever it is. I'll take it from whoever gives it to me. So if you put Nepal first, then how you leverage that to transform Nepal, rather than it's not putting India first or China first, but if you put Nepal first, the rest of the logic will I think unfold. And in Southeast Asia here, the region benefited enormously by the US-China collaboration that has taken place in the last 40 years. In fact, Singapore, for example, is celebrating 30th anniversary of establishment of diplomatic relations in this year, 30th. That is, Singapore did not have formal diplomatic relations with China till 1990. Same case with Indonesia. While India had it in 1950, Nepal in 1955. So a lot of the region was deeply suspicious of China. So they didn't have much relationship until 90. But as US-China came together, the region has had fantastic ties to both the countries. And their challenge today is how do you deal with the conflict that is emerging between the two countries. So, but this is a new challenge for everyone. And the question, the trick for countries everywhere is how do you keep benefiting from the engagement with the major powers without getting trapped in their political conflicts? It's not going to be easy, but each country will have to find its own solutions to this. Okay, Pramod, shall we?
We still have lots of questions, but we'll end it here, sir. Thank you very much, Professor Rajamohan, for your time. It was a wonderful session. We learned a lot.
I can't hear you.
Hello?
Pramod, I can't hear you. Yeah, now it's better.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your valuable time.